Good evening, everyone. It's nice to be back online. I pray all of you are doing well, staying safe at home. So tonight we're going to finish what we started last week, which is chapter 22 of Genesis, which is the command that God gave to Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Now, what we focused on last week were two ways to read Old Testament stories, is to pay attention to how much is said and how much is withheld. Because remember, as I mentioned last week, when the Old Testament storytellers, they didn't give a lot of detail, at least not like the detail that we're used to when we're reading through modern novels or even ancient Greek poems or ancient Roman works. So because of that, it's a different style that we need to get used to. So the Bible does the Old Testament storytellers, they withhold a lot of those details. So that means you need to pay very close attention to what is said because that makes it all the more significant. The Old Testament authors only said what was important to the story, what was important to their message. By and large, that's the case. So we pay attention. So we're going to pay attention to specific words, phrases, and details. And then, secondly, when they tell stories, pay attention to the rhythm. That's related to the fact that they don't say a lot of things. So you want to pay attention to how many verbs come in a sequence, how much detail are they going into, what's the flow, what's the rhythm. So we started looking at this last week. To start off, we saw that God told Abraham, he said, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac. And so it identified Isaac in three different ways, which is very uncharacteristic of the Bible. That's a lot of detail when we just expect him to say, take Isaac your son, or take your son, or take Isaac. But it gives three different adjectives or descriptions for Isaac. So that means it's focusing on the relationship between Isaac and his father, Abraham. And that told us that the role that Isaac plays in the story is his significant relationship to Abraham. That's the primary role Isaac plays. And then we also saw that, surprisingly, Abraham, there is no response from him whatsoever. We don't see what he's thinking. We don't see what he's feeling. He doesn't say anything in response, which seems to be even uncharacteristic of Abraham himself. We even got a verse in the preceding chapter when God told him to send his son Ishmael away. We were told that it distressed him, and we get no such response here, which seems strange, but all what that does is it highlights the fact that Abraham immediately went into very quick action in order to fulfill God's command. So instead of, by not dwelling on Abraham's response, his emotional or thought response, it just highlights the fact that he obeys immediately. No matter what the command is, he obeys it. Then we saw the rapid 6 verbs in a row in a single verse. We saw that Abraham does 6 actions essentially back to back. In one verse, Abraham does 6 things, which is, so you want to pay attention to how many verbs occur in one sentence or in a short time span. So that tells us that Abraham is acting rapidly. Then we skipped 3 days. We hear nothing about the 3-day journey until Abraham is able to see it, the place he's supposed to go to. And then on the journey, there are 2 interruptions. There are 2 stops along the way. And what that does is it heightens the suspense. So they leave, and the first stop, Abraham tells his servants to stay behind, and he refers to Isaac as the boy. Remember how we said, pay attention to what people call each other? He says he calls Isaac the boy, maybe what the author is trying to tell us is that Abraham is trying to distance himself. He's not. If he calls him his son, perhaps he'll break down. Perhaps he won't be able to handle it, at least at that point. And he also says that he'll return with the boy. Both of them will return. So we asked, what's his meaning? What does he mean by that? Because when characters say things, we can't always take it at face value. When characters say things, it tells us something deeper about their character. Whether it's the truth or whether it's false, it tells us something about them. And we don't know exactly what Abraham is saying yet. Then the second interruption, he goes on with the boy, with his son, Isaac. And then the second interruption along the way is Isaac asking his father a question. He says, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And then we mentioned how this is the only conversation we ever see between Abraham and Isaac. And it's an astonishing, it's a deep, it's an intimate conversation at that. So pay attention to who says things, when, how, and how often. That'll tell you something about the characters and their relationship. And we see Abraham makes another statement about the sacrifice. He says that God will provide the sheep. Again, we're thinking, okay, what does Abraham mean exactly? Does he honestly think God's going to provide a sheep? And what it seems to us at that point, what I mentioned, perhaps we see a man of deep faith. We don't know for sure yet from what he says. Does he believe that God will somehow work things out, that God will intervene to restore his son? And that brings us to where we are today, which is verses 9 and 10. So after that second interruption on the way to the journey, the two of them, Abraham and his son Isaac, they continue on towards the destination. And in verse 9, they finally arrive at where God had told him to go. Now, before we jump in, let's say a prayer. Our Father, we thank you for this time and opportunity to study your word in depth, to come together online in this way. Lord, we pray for your Spirit to open our eyes, to see and perceive the truth, to understand it and to apply it. Transform us by what we learn tonight, Lord. May we draw ever closer to you in your Son. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. So finally, verse 9, they arrive at the place that God had told Abraham to go to. And then what we see is Abraham prepares everything. And again, this is another rapid 4 verbs, essentially back to back. He built the altar, he arranged the wood, he tied Isaac, and he placed Isaac on the wood. So he built, he arranged, he tied, and he placed, all in a single verse. He wastes no time whatsoever when he reaches the site. Again, Abraham is not wasting any time in fulfilling God's commandment, even though this is the most horrific, deep, emotional thing that Abraham can possibly do. He wastes no time whatsoever, emphasizing his obedience to God's command. And then note, I had mentioned this briefly last week. In verse 6, it says that Abraham had put the wood on Isaac. And now in verse 9, we see that he put Isaac on the wood. So it's this tragic, ironic reversal where in verse 6, he puts the wood on Isaac. Isaac is carrying the very thing unknowingly that will be the cause, or at least part of the cause, of his death. So now we see Abraham put Isaac on the wood. And then all of a sudden, after that rapid 4 verbs in one verse, everything slows down dramatically. It's like all of a sudden we're in slow motion because a single verse tells us something that happens that only takes a second or two to happen. It says, Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. So note the difference in pace. All of a sudden, everything slows down to a standstill. And we can picture Abraham reaching out his hand, grabbing the knife in order to slaughter his son. This is the most detailed, this is the slowest verse that we get in this whole scene. This is one of the slowest verses we probably see in probably the whole Old Testament. So now it has reached a climax. Now we're at the tipping point. We're at the verge of Abraham fulfilling God's commandment to sacrifice his son. This is what everything has been leading up to. All of this tension. And notice what it says. Abraham took the knife in order to slaughter his son. That tells us that he had every intention of carrying out the commandment. Abraham wasn't bluffing. Abraham wasn't kind of twiddling his thumbs and going slow. His hands weren't sweating, and he's like, okay, any minute now, God. We see that he had every intention of fulfilling the commandment. He did not, by all appearances, expect God to intervene. This shows a man of the deepest, most sincere commitment and obedience to God's commandments. This is something else to note about Old Testament narratives. When the narrator says something, it's true. When God or the author, the narrator, not one of the characters, when God or the narrator says something, we can take it at face value. On the other hand, when characters say something, we have to pay close attention. We have to discern. Are they telling the truth? Do they really mean what they're saying? Is there underlying meaning? Are they not telling the whole story? Remember, we looked at that with what Abraham said. What exactly does Abraham mean when he says he'll return? What does he mean when he tells Isaac that God will provide a lamb? Is he being sincere? Is he being serious? Is he being hopeful? Is he in denial? Is he doubtful? But when the narrator or God says something, we know it's true. So that's something to pay attention to when you're reading these stories. Who is saying what? In this case, we have the narrator telling us that Abraham did it with the intention of killing his son, slaughtering his son, which means that was Abraham's intention. And then that brings us to verse 11 and 12, which is the climax. This is the third and final address to Abraham when someone calls out to him. And this time, it's the angel of the Lord. And the angel calls out to Abraham and says, Abraham, Abraham. He says his name twice. Perhaps that's a sense of urgency. Abraham, Abraham, because he has the knife in his hand and he's about to slaughter his son. And then the angel breaks into the scene and says, Abraham, Abraham. And then we get the third obedient, attentive response from Abraham. He says again, I'm here. He said it to God at the beginning when God said, Abraham. He said, I'm here. What is it? When Isaac said to him in the middle at that deep, poignant moment where we're just waiting to see what's going to happen. Isaac says, Father. And Abraham says, I'm here, son. And now we see Abraham is present again. The angel of the Lord calls out, and Abraham says, yes, I'm here. What is it? So each time someone calls to Abraham, someone mentions his name, someone addresses him, and Abraham says, I'm here, that is at a key point in the story. And then we see what the angel says to Abraham. The angel, you see this in other places as well. Oftentimes when it says the angel of God is speaking, suddenly it sounds like God himself is speaking. And that's because the angel's words are God's words. Exact. So there seems to be some interchangeability between the angel and God speaking because it's God's message. In any case, the angel says in God's voice or God's words, "Now I know that you fear God." Should we be scratching our heads here? Now I know that you fear God. What? Now you know that Abraham fears God? Now God knows that Abraham fears God after everything Abraham has done, after everything Abraham has been through, after all of the communications and the talks and the pleading and the bargaining with God, etc., etc. After all of that, now God knows that Abraham fears him. Abraham left his home. He trusted God without any assurance. He continually worshiped him at every step of the journey. He continually built altars. He continually called upon God's name. And now Abraham has established that he fears God. All of that still didn't guarantee that fact. Abraham had to demonstrate that he would give up absolutely everything. And the deepest, most poignant thing that Abraham can demonstrate his fear of God is by giving up his son. One of the most, if not the most precious thing that a man could give up back in those ancient times. The son being the one who will carry on the name. You will live on through your children. Your children are security, they are protection to you, etc., etc. And he has to give that up. After all that time, he's finally gotten Isaac, and now he has to give him up. This showed, without a doubt, that Abraham feared God. So this brings up a question. Doesn't God know everything? Didn't God already know that Abraham feared him? Didn't God already know that Abraham would sacrifice his son? This is a question for us, I think, that we ask, that makes sense to us, because we often think of fear or faith or love as an almost purely internal state. Oh yes, I have trust in God. I have faith in God, and it's something that just happens in my head. Oh yeah, Abraham fears God. It's just something that's inside of him. But these things, fear, faith, and love, they are only really present when we act on them. We don't, our faith, as we hear in James, is nothing without works, meaning it's dead, it's useless, it's non-faith. So in a similar sense here, the fear that Abraham has is not fully realized until he puts that fear to the ultimate test, until he puts that fear into action. So Abraham has that potential to fear inside of him, that potential to act on the fear he has for God. But it is not yet fully expressed until he acts on it. So if Abraham's fear of God was still in question after everything he had done, what does that mean for us? If Abraham went through all of that, if he trusted God and he obeyed him and he worshiped him constantly, and he still had to do that to demonstrate his fear to God, what does that mean for us? Are we giving up absolutely everything that we have as our faith, our trust in God, Are we putting that into action? Are we making it real by giving up absolutely everything we have, just as Abraham did? This reminds me of Luke 14:26 through 33. I'll just give you one verse. Jesus says, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple." This is very similar to the story that we're reading. Hate, in the sense of regarding as less important than God's commandments, less important than the love and fear of God. If we don't regard anything and everything, including those closest and most dear to us, as less than God's commandments, we cannot be Jesus' disciple. Therefore, if Abraham had withheld his son from God, if he had not given up that which is most precious and dear to him, we can ask, could he have been the follower of God that we know him to be? Could he have been the father of a multitude of nations? Could he have been the father of the promise if he had withheld his most precious son? So, what this tells us is if you commit to God, just as Abraham did when he left his homeland, once you make that step, once you make that commitment, you need to go all the way or you're not going at all. It requires faithful, obedient action all the way. And Abraham did just that. He completed what he started. He went all the way and he demonstrated the true fear of God. So that is why God can say, "Now I know that you fear me," because he put it into action. He made it real. And the same thing goes for us. We need to put that faith, that love, that fear into action, or else it's nothing. It's non-faith. It's non-fear. It essentially doesn't exist. Okay, that brings us to verse 13. So we've reached the climax, and now we're going towards the resolution. Abraham looks up and he sees a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So we finally see that what Abraham said is all coming true. He told his son Isaac that God would provide the sheep, and so God did. He provided the ram, and Abraham offered it in place of his son. So I'm going to go on another, this brings me to another point. Offering a substitute in place of the firstborn son. What Abraham does here foreshadows God's commandment to Israel on Sinai. The redemption of the firstborn son. So the command was that you need, when you have your first son, you need to redeem him because your firstborn son belongs to God. Your firstborn son is God's. And what people used to do, and what pagans did, what the Canaanites did, and we even see people in Israel and Judah doing this, because they believed the firstborn belonged to God, they would sacrifice their firstborn son. This seems to be, we don't know how common this practice was, but we know it existed. The Bible attributes it to the Canaanites, but we also see Judahites and Israelites doing the same thing. The king of Moab did it in 2 Kings 3:27. Ahaz did it in 2 Kings 16:3. Manasseh did it in 2 Kings 21:6. Kings of Judah, they sacrificed their own sons by making them pass through fire. And we even see Josiah when he brought his reformation, he destroyed the place where children were sacrificed. That's 2 Kings 23:10. So we see that child sacrifice was practiced, of course, frowned upon, but that stemmed at least partly from the belief that the firstborn son belonged to God. And so the command that God made to the Israelites was that they were supposed to redeem the firstborn son, buy them back by offering a substitute in their place, probably a sheep. You could see this in Exodus 34:20, among many other places. So just as Abraham offered a sheep in place of his son, so every Israelite was supposed to do the same. So we can think of this as kind of like a foreshadowing of the redemption of the firstborn son. So by providing the sheep, God provided redemption for Isaac. And this should sound very familiar to us Christians. Redemption, the firstborn son. This passage in particular strikes me because it bears remarkable similarities to the gospel message of Jesus Christ. And I'm going to give you three that are very similar. First of all, remember when God had commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son, his only son? That phrase, which in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, in the Greek, that phrase, huios agapetos, is the exact same phrase that God uses in reference to Jesus. So God tells Abraham, take your huios agapetos, and then when Jesus is baptized, God says, this is my huios agapetos, my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased. Mark 1:11. The exact same phrase, the beloved son or the only son, Isaac and Jesus. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is much less obvious, but perhaps it bears some similarity, is that remember how Isaac carried the wood to his sacrifice. Recall, what did Jesus do? As stated in John 19:17, Jesus carried his cross. In other places, the cross is called the tree, which is the same word as wood. Jesus carried his tree. He carried the wood to his sacrifice, just like Isaac had done. And then, finally, to top it off, as I had just mentioned, God provides the lamb. God provided the sheep to Abraham as a substitute for Isaac, who was the son of promise. In the same sense, God provides the lamb. Jesus Christ, his one and only, dearly beloved Son, to redeem us, the children of promise. So this scene seems to capture the gospel message as a foreshadowing, as kind of like a very strong resemblance that will ultimately be fulfilled in Jesus Christ. So not only is this a defining moment for Abraham in his faith and in his walk with God, but it's a defining moment for the world as well. Because it is through Abraham and Isaac that Jesus Christ will come. So if this had not taken place, perhaps Jesus Christ would not have come through Abraham and Isaac. So that brings us to verse 14, where Abraham names the site, names the place where all of this happened. He called it God will see. That's literally what it says, but we translate it God will provide. And in 2 Chronicles 3:1, it says that Mount Moriah is the place where Solomon built the temple. So that being the case, we see that Isaac's near sacrifice and the sacrifice of Jesus took place in almost identical locations. Jesus on Golgotha, which is right outside of Jerusalem, right outside of the place where the temple is. So we even see Jesus' death occurring in essentially the same place as the redemption of Isaac, the near sacrifice of the one and only Son. So all of these strong connections and similarities lead me to believe that this passage can be looked on as by us Christians as a foreshadowing of the redemption through Jesus Christ. God will provide. That was Abraham's statement of profound faith. God will provide. And so he did, and so he does. So that seems to be a fitting conclusion to the story. We could end it there and we wouldn't feel like anything was missing. But then it goes on to give us an additional 4 verses. So let's look at those. And this will be the last section before we close. At the end of the story, the angel speaks to Abraham a second time. And this time, the angel reaffirms the promise that God had originally made to Abraham. But this time it's a little bit different. He doesn't just state the promise. He doesn't just say, I will give you the land and you will have numerous descendants. But he adds something significant twice. At the beginning in verse 16, God says through the angel, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will give you, etc., etc. And then at the very end, verse 18, God gives the promise to Abraham, because you have obeyed me. All of a sudden, the promise seems to have been conditional the whole time. God will fulfill the promises because Abraham obeyed him. Before, in the earlier promises in chapters 12, 13, 15, and 17, it seemed to be almost unconditional, except for maybe circumcision. God just said, I will do this for you. In 12:1 through 3, he says, go and I will make you a great nation. In 12:7, he states, to your offspring I will give this land. In 13:14 through 17, God says, I will multiply your descendants and I will give them the whole land. In chapter 15, God made a one-sided covenant with Abraham. God is the one who passed between the animal parts. Remember, that's the sign that God says, I will make sure that I keep my end of the covenant. Abraham didn't have his end of the covenant. There was nothing for Abraham to do. It seemed unconditional. And then in chapter 17, we see God make a covenant a second time with Abraham. And again, the only condition seemed to have been circumcision. And now, the last time that God states his promise to Abraham, we see that there is a condition: Abraham's obedience. Abraham not withholding anything from God. Now, this may seem like a contradiction. All this whole time, God is just saying, I'm going to do this for you. And then all of a sudden, God said, because you obeyed, I will do this for you. But this is actually not a contradiction. It is actually consistent with the earlier promises. The promises had always actually been dependent on Abraham's obedience from the very beginning. In verse 12, chapter 1, we see that God told him, go, and I will make you a great nation. ... In order for God to make Abraham a great nation and bless him and give him descendants and bless the world, Abraham had to go. He had to have faith and act on it. Presumably, if Abraham hadn't went, none of this would have happened. So obedience is a necessary part of the promise. And then in chapter 15, the first covenant, it says that Abraham trusted God and God reckoned it to him as righteousness. So again, there's that active trust despite all odds. And then in chapter 17, the second covenant, we see that you need to be circumcised, an obedient act, or else you'll be cut off from the people. You cannot have the promise unless you obediently act in joining the covenant through circumcision. And then finally, in this final test, chapter 22, Abraham had to give up everything. His dear only son, Isaac. He had to give him up to God. That faithful obedience guaranteed the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. And this is highlighted by the fact, this continuity of God's promise and Abraham's faithful obedience going hand in hand. It's inseparable. This is highlighted by the fact that 12:1, the beginning of the Abraham story, and chapter 22, which is near the end of the Abraham story, we have the exact same phrase. God tells Abraham, go. This is the only time, these are the only two times in the entire Bible where we see this exact phrase. Go yourself. That's what it means. That's what it is literally. Go yourself. So that tells you these two parts correspond to each other. Also, in chapter 12, God had told Abraham, he told him three things. Go from your land, your homeland, your father's house. Chapter 22, we see the same thing. Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac. Three things that are extremely significant to Abraham. Chapter 12, chapter 22. And then lastly, one final similarity is in both places, God tells him to go to a place that I will show you. Go and offer him on one of the mountains that I will tell you. All of this tells us is we're supposed to think of these as corresponding to each other. What Abraham began his faith in chapter 12 by going, Abraham completed by his faith in chapter 22 at the end by offering his son, Isaac. He completed the faithful obedience that he had started. So this is what we learn from the stories of Abraham. Promise and obedience go hand in hand. They are inseparable. You cannot have the promise without the faithful obedience. When we become Christians, two things happen. On God's part, we receive the promise of redemption and everlasting life. And then on our part, we commit ourselves to complete faithful obedience. just as Abraham did. When Abraham left his land, he was binding himself to God. When he made those covenants in 15 and 17, he bound himself in covenant to God, and that required faithful obedience on Abraham's part. In a similar sense, we make a covenant with God, the new covenant, through the blood of Jesus Christ. When we enter into that covenant with God, we receive the promise and we commit ourselves to faithful obedience. So we can't enjoy the promise if we are not maintaining and growing in faithful obedience, what God has called us to. The reason I keep saying faithful obedience is because that's how I'm translating the word faith. That's how I'm interpreting the word faith. Again, we often think of faith as just something that we believe in our heads. Oh, I believe there's a God. I have faith. Oh, I believe that God sent his son. Oh, that means I have faith. But what it truly means for God to say, now I know that you fear me. Now I know that you have faith in me. It requires faithful, obedient action. And what we see in Abraham, in the stories of Abraham in his life, God didn't test him at the very beginning. It didn't say God tasted Abraham before he had even called him and he said, hey, go sacrifice your son. What we see is a building up. The first time he told him to leave his homeland, something that's hard enough. But then the final test, at the end of Abraham's stories, we see the ultimate test of his faith and fear. So Abraham's faith became real by his obedience. And so that's what we are called to as well. That is one very significant thing that we can learn from Abraham. By reading through his stories, we can see his faith. We see him possibly slip up here and there. We see him maybe lose some faith when he pretends that his wife is his sister. And he lets her be taken by two different kings. We do see Abraham slip up, but in the end, he is completely and faithfully obedient. So as we are walking with God in our faith, we are continually growing. We should be deepening our faith until we can ultimately give up absolutely everything. That is faith. That is trust. That is faithfulness. So with that, we will conclude the stories of Abraham. Next week, we'll start looking at some stories with Isaac. In particular, we'll look at Rebecca in chapter 24. I pray that this was instructive, and may God bless you all.